Hey guys, welcome back to Medical Coding with Blue. Okay, today's episode we are talking about the breakdown of Munchausen's syndrome. Okay, so before I begin, all right, there is one thing to keep in mind when it comes to dealing with Munchausen's. We have to make sure we know who the patient is in relation to this Munchausen's, because Munchausen's syndrome or facetious syndrome refers to a person who is self-inflicting symptoms upon themselves to make themselves sick. And the official definition is a facetious disorder imposed on self, or Munchausen syndrome is a disorder in which a person falsely reports or causes his or her own physical or psychological symptoms. Okay, and it says for patients with documented facetious disorder on self or Munchausen syndrome, assign the appropriate code from subcategory F68.1, facetious disorder imposed on self. So there's that one. If the person is doing that to themselves, and this is coming straight from the ICD-10 book, okay? If they are doing this to themselves, then we are dealing with that F68 series, okay? However, there's Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Now, this refers to when a patient is let me just read it to you. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is a disorder in which a caregiver or perpetrator falsely reports or causes an illness or injury to another person, the victim, under his or her care, such as a child, elderly person, or a person with a disability. This condition is also referred to as facetious disorder imposed on another, or facetious disorder by proxy. The perpetrator, not the victim, receives this diagnosis. Okay, so listen to that very carefully. Munchausen syndrome by proxy, it goes on the perpetrator and not the victim. Never should it ever be pinned on the victim, okay? They are going to receive the abuse code if there's something that happens to them. Oftentimes, just an example, they could get starved. You know, the victim of the perpetrator will be starved, and maybe that is going to get some attention, or whatever the case may be, that they're trying, whatever their goal is, to make the other person sick. So in that instance, it would be abuse for the victim. When the victim comes in, we know that if the provider notes that their caregiver has this Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or the caregiver suffers from Munchausen's, the patient is going to end up with the abuse code, okay? Because they are being abused. Think about that. The patient doesn't have, or the victim does not have Munchausen's. It is their caregiver. So always be aware of those. I know it gets a little like hinky, like which way do I go? When it comes to Munchausen's, just keep in mind who is being treated, okay? If it is the patient that has it, or the perpetrator, okay? I hate to say a perpetrator, but if they are doing this to another individual, then it's Munchausen syndrome by proxy for the perpetrator, okay? Or if they are suffering from Munchausen syndrome, something that they're doing to themselves only, okay? Then that would be Munchausen syndrome. If they're doing it to others, if they're the perpetrator, it would be Munchausen syndrome by proxy, okay? And with the abuse, you always want to make sure that the provider is noting everything that they need to, as far as how the injury occurred, what happened, when did it happen. All of this, especially in the outpatient setting, or any really good documentation, is going to be able to carry over all of that information so that it's well documented in the record. What are the details of this injury as far as what happened with this patient, okay? So it is, I know it was a little tricky, that one, but I did it on purpose because there's 3 separate scenarios that can happen when it comes to dealing with a patient with Munchausen's. So this is why you have to really look at what is going on in the record. Who is the record referring to? Is it referring to the perpetrator, or is it referring to the victim of the Munchausen's? Okay. So it's a very interesting, when you get into the psych diagnosis, it gets very interesting. It gets very in-depth. And I always recommend that you speak with your provider about documentation improvement if they are not documenting as well as they should. Now, when it comes to psych documentation, sometimes some providers are a little bit hesitant to put lots of detail in, or perhaps they just don't want to have to list out everything. But the diagnosis selection does have to reflect what is documented in the record, okay? These things are confidential, so they should take solace in that, that it's not going to go everywhere. But at the same time, I think maybe sometimes it's just a lengthy process, or maybe they're just concerned for the patient's privacy. It could be any number of things. But again, the documentation always has to be supported with the diagnosis selection and the procedures that are being selected as well. Okay, we're going to be talking later about the minutes that need to be documented if they're doing counseling and those kinds of things. But as we break these things down, and psych is one of those ones that it does get to be very detailed, as with most other specialties as well. But you really do have to, in the instance of this Munchausen's, really do pay attention to who is doing what, okay? So the victim is always going to have that abuse code, the T code, okay? It is T76, adult and child abuse, neglect, and or maltreatment suspected, okay? Or confirmed. T74, adult and child abuse, neglect, and other maltreatment confirmed, okay? So you have the two codes, the either suspected or you have the one that is confirmed. So just be sure again to marry up the two, the documentation and the code selection, okay? And again, when you are speaking with your providers, you can show them the available diagnosis, because sometimes they don't have an idea of which diagnosis there is, or sometimes they don't know that these other diagnoses are available. So you want to make sure that they understand these as well. If somebody else in your facility takes care of this sort of thing, then work with them to work with a provider, okay? If their documentation is lacking, okay, when it comes to these kinds of things. So it does get a little bit more advanced when they have other things as well, like if a Munchausen's syndrome patient has depression, anxiety, PTSD, and all of these get to be a little bit where you have to think about which code selections you are using, because sometimes there is a combination code, and then sometimes it is going to be a symptom of, so on and so forth. So you do have to watch for those things and make sure that you're not putting together diagnoses that don't need to be together, okay? And that as well. So knowing the process, the disease process, is also going to help you, which is why I have been trying to make sure that I promote that critical thinking when I am doing these exercises. The next exercise that I'm going to be talking about will be about the use, abuse, and dependence. In which do you report when the provider documents either or all of the above, use, abuse, or dependence. So I know, just one step at a time. But remember, the takeaway from this video is know who the patient is. Is this patient the patient that has Munchausen syndrome or Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or is this the victim of the perpetrator, in which time that they would get the abuse code, the T74 or T76, depending on which is documented. Okay, so that way it'll all come together. But fascinating stuff, right? And you can also reference the ICD-10 book, reference the beginning part of chapter 5, and it does give a breakdown of Munchausen's, and it gives you the example. So that way you can further read it if you choose to further read. But that is where you can look for additional information about that. Okay, but take the time to review that section as well, the Munchausen section, so that way you can see, because there's such a breakdown of the different, with the physical symptoms and psychological symptoms. That's something that you really have to look at there as well. When the patient has Munchausen syndrome with physical symptoms, or they have it with psychological, you want to be able to make sure that you are selecting the most definitive, most specific diagnosis code that you can based on the documentation. Okay, so sometimes the provider may not select the code specifically, but if the documentation supports it, then you can bump the specificity of the code selected. Okay, so something to keep in mind. And it's not that you're trying to diagnose the patient. If the documentation supports it, then that's when you would choose a more specific code. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed that one. But yes, so that's it. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one up. I have a few more videos to do today. So if you have any questions about Munchausen's, let me know. Comment below. Give me a thumbs up if this video helped you. And I will see y'all on the next episode. So if you are a medical coder, a medical coding student, somebody curious about the fascinating world of medical coding, a provider or a nurse, I invite you to like and subscribe and follow me on my journey in medical coding. I will see y'all on the next episode. Bye!